Okay, so clearly we've looked at a whole bunch of attacks on the network and on hosts. Now, the question is, how do we protect against such attacks? And this is the topic of this video, network protection, which actually also might include protecting the end hosts. As usual, I'm listing a few references at the start of this video for you to look at further details. I'm not going to go through this on this video. The networks are vulnerable at different entry points, for instance, in the routers, the wireless access points, and the modems, and also the networks themselves are vulnerable at different levels, at the network level, the protocol level, and the application level. And these are all the kinds of attacks that we've looked at in previous videos. Now, how do we keep our assets safe, our networks safe? Well, there are two major approaches there. We can either go for detection or we can go for prevention. In principle, you always want to prevent attacks, but there's a trade-off there. Because if you really want to prevent all the attacks, then you're going to maybe reject some network requests that are coming in. You want to reject all the possible events related to an attack. Right? So don't let these packets coming from the network into your web server or your FTP server or your DNS server, etc. But what if you're too careful? What if you're too strict on what you allow because you really want to stop all of these attacks, you want to prevent them? And maybe you're going to reject some of the traffic that isn't malicious at all. And in that case, you're reducing the availability. You're kind of denying the service to some of the legitimate clients, and you're dropping legitimate traffic on your network. Okay? So, especially for prevention of intrusions, it's very, very tricky not to reject too much because it will immediately hurt your clients and maybe your revenue or whatever it is that you want to get out of your resources. Whereas with detection, it's a little bit easier. You're trying to detect anomalous behavior and then raise an alarm, right? So you just raise an alert, and then somebody will have to look at this and say, "Oh, this is really an attack that's going on. Let's now stop everything and clean up our systems or what have you." Okay? Because you don't immediately drop stuff, it's slightly less dangerous. You don't have to do this in real time with prevention. You have to do this in real time. You have to decide then and there that you're not going to allow this traffic, and that is, of course, a little harder. So let's have a look at an intrusion detection system. What an intrusion detection system needs to do is analyze the actions performed by users and application, and then see if there are any malicious activities. So it will take a series of events, and these could be, network level events, such as what you've collected in traffic dumps, or it could be OS level events, things that have been captured in auditing logs, such as kernel message logs and what have you. Could be application level events that have been collected in, the logs of a web server or the logs of another application. Anyway, these kind of events, or it could be sensor level events. Anyway, a collection of events, and it is a challenge for the intrusion detection system, for the IDS, to look at these events and say, here's a stream of events that I've had, and there's a series of past system states that I've seen. Can we now conclude that with this event, E5 in this particular case, and occurring in this current state S5, can we conclude that this is evidence of an attack taking place? The final conclusive evidence. That is what an intrusion detection system needs to do. And so the way these intrusion detection systems operate at from a very high level point of view is that we obtain events right from the devices or from the network or what have you, and the events go into a system that makes use of knowledge about what attacks really mean. So how do you recognize that there is an attack? And if there is an attack detected in the events provided by the event provider, it will actually go to a response module, which can do a number of things. So first of all, it can log the event in an alert database. It could do something actively to these systems. For instance, it could reconfigure firewalls, or maybe drop some TCP connections or what have you. And it can update our knowledge of what attacks and normal behavior look like. Okay. There are many ways in which we can classify such IDSs. First of all, we can look at the approaches. Are they based on misuse or anomalies? So misuse detection means that you have a very clear idea of what bad behavior is. You have a model of malicious behavior. This could be, for instance, a pattern of bytes in an input stream, right? So you know that if these bytes are in this network packet, it will actually be part of an exploit. Okay? And then you match these bytes that you see in the event stream with these known patterns, and then you know it's that particular attack. So that's one way of doing it. The other way in which you can do it is by means of anomalies. So you're just detecting something is out of the ordinary, right? So you have a model of what normal behavior is, and then you see that something deviates from this normal behavior. And once you find this anomalous entry in the event stream, then you raise an alarm. You can also classify by the sources of the events. For instance, are these OS audit records, are these network packets, application logs, or intrusion detection alerts, and so on. We can also look at the timeliness. Is the IDS operating in real time, so online, continuous, or is it non-real time, where you operate maybe offline and maybe periodically you process your logs and see whether there has been an attack. You can classify it by the response type. Is it passive? Does it just create and log alerts? Or is it active? And does it actually try to do something about the attack, such as reconfigure your firewall? And finally, we can classify it by the state dependency. Is the IDS a stateful processing, a stateful analysis, or a stateless analysis? So as promised, let's go back to this misuse-based versus anomaly-based intrusion detection. If we're talking about misuse-based, we have some major advantages. For instance, since we know exactly what we're looking for, we know exactly what an intrusion or attack looks like, the pattern that goes with it, we generate very few false alarms. If this is in the network traffic, we know it's that attack. If this is happening on our system, we know it's that attack. Moreover, we know that it's an attack, and we know exactly which attack it is and what is going on. It provides, in other words, identification and explanation. And it requires really easy to understand attack models. Okay, that's good. And it's hard to evade this, right? So if you want to exploit this system, you need to have maybe this specific pattern in your network traffic. And evading the IDS might be more complicated. And it's very fast generally. It also has some major disadvantages, though. For instance, you have to have this database of signatures of attacks, and this needs to be refreshed constantly. Okay. Moreover, it's your system is vulnerable often to these overstimulation attacks, where you actually throw lots of things at this IDS with complicated patterns that simply require a lot of checking, and it might actually cause a denial of service attack through the IDS. Okay, and finally, it's limited to what it can detect, right? It's limited to exactly the signatures that you have in your database. You cannot go beyond that. It will never be able to detect a new attack. What about anomaly detection? Well, anomaly detection is the exact opposite. So the advantages are that it will detect unknown attacks. So because after all, it doesn't have a model of what normal behavior is, right? It doesn't have a model of what malicious behavior is, what the attack pattern is, but rather it has a model of what normal behavior is, and it looks at deviations. So that also means that, strictly speaking, doesn't need a lot of updating. It needs updating whenever the normal behavior changes. On the downside, it's quite difficult to configure because you have to train the system to learn, what the regular behavior is, and then to detect what is an attack. It also assumes that anomalous means malicious, and that is not always the case. Maybe the user has installed a new program that does something else on the network or on the system. Okay, and the biggest problem is perhaps that it is prone to generating a lot of false alarms. So if you simply see something that is, an outlier, something unusual that deviates from normal behavior, and you classify it as an attack, it may not be an attack, and this might be quite expensive because all the false alarms that you generate, somebody needs to check them, right? So that may be a lot of additional work. Okay. Moreover, if you take action based on these false alarms, you might be dropping legitimate traffic or stopping legitimate activities. Another disadvantage is that it's often easy to evade, right? So you make sure that your behavior is just so that it will not be classified as an outlier. Okay, sometimes if the model gets updated over time, because that's what you need to do, because the application usage and the patterns that you observe in normal behavior changes over time, your IDS might be susceptible to what is known as frog boiling, right? So there's this myth, which is untrue, by the way, that if you put a frog in a pan of boiling water, the frog doesn't like it and it will jump out. But if you put the frog in a pan cold water and then you bring it to the boil gradually, the frog will not notice the changes in temperature and will not jump out. Apparently, this is all not true. At any rate, I don't want you to try this, but this is what you can do with these anomaly-based systems, right? Where you change your behavior just a little bit such that the model gets changed and the model doesn't uh, um, realize that something anomalous is going on because the differences are too small, the deviation is too small, and so the model changes. And this is how you can nudge the model into a direction that you want as an attacker. Another disadvantage is that it doesn't provide much explanation. It doesn't give you the identification of what kind of attack is going on. It just says, something is out of the ordinary. And a final disadvantage, which is perhaps not the biggest one, is that it's usually a little bit slower and more resource intensive. When we talk about misuse, there's one thing that I want to emphasize still, and that is that we talk about signatures so far, but it might also be something like a general model of what, say, a particular class of problems is. So, say a buffer overflow. If we know what a buffer overflow looks like and it detects that, that is also misuse detection. So it might be detecting a class of attacks, or control flow diversion, right? So anything that changes the control flow in a program might be considered a pattern of misuse. So whenever we, for instance, see a change of the value on the return address on the stack that is coming from an untrusted source, that might be classified as an attack. That is misuse detection. So it's a little bit more generic than just this one particular exploit. It's a class of attacks in some cases. Some issues in intrusion detection. So first of all, an intrusion detection analyzes the manifestation of an attack and not necessarily the attack itself, right? You see the behavior that the attack causes. Okay, and the capability of the intrusion detection and the quality of that depends heavily on the quality of the event stream. So what do you get in terms of events, and how reliable are they, and how detailed are they? In other words, the evidence for detecting attacks determines the capability of the intrusion detection system. And the effectiveness depends heavily on what analysis technique you use. And here, precision is very important. So let's talk about a number of terms that we use in intrusion detection. We're going to do this by means of an example, right? So if we have a system that will flag an intrusion for every event in the event stream, we will achieve 100% detection rate. So we do simply classify everything as an attack. But clearly, this is not the kind of intrusion system that we're looking for. So what is the balance? How do we make this trade-off? And for this, I want to talk you through a number of terms. that we're going to use in this lecture, and that are used in general in the area of intrusion detection. So we speak of a hit or a true positive if we detect an attack. So we say that an attack occurred and there really was an attack. We talk of a miss if we did not detect an attack where an attack did occur, okay, also known as a false negative. We talk about a false positive or a false alarm if we detect something, we say that an attack occurred if it did not occur, so there was no attack. And we talk about a true negative if we do not flag something as an attack and there really also was no attack in the event stream. Okay. We talk about false positives, true positives, and false positives and negatives in a confusion matrix. So this is how we often represent this. And a confusion matrix looks like this. So on these two rows here indicate what we predict. So we predicted a positive, so that means there was an attack, or we predicted negative, which means there was no attack. And then here in the columns, we have the actual value. Was there an attack? So in that case, it's a true positive if we predicted positively, if we predicted an attack, or it's a false negative if we missed it, right? If there was no attack, so it's a negative, but we predicted that there was an attack, then it means it's a false positive. And if there was no attack and we also said there was no attack, we're talking about a true negative. And we often fill this in with numbers. So in this particular case, we had, let's see, 10,000 events, right? And for 9,700 of them, we said there is no attack, right? Nothing is wrong with this. And in reality, there's also no attack. So these are all true negatives, 9,700 true negatives. Okay. There were apparently 100 attacks that we detected, and that were real attacks. We also missed a bunch. So we missed 50 attacks. So we said there was no attack, but there really was an attack. And then we classified 150 of them as an attack, even though there was no attack at all. So now here's the example. Suppose we have an event stream with 100 attacks in them, and we have 5 different intrusion detection systems. The first intrusion detection system detects 50 attacks out of the actual 100 attacks. Intrusion detection system 1 detects 90, but only 80 of those are actual attacks. Okay, so 10 are false positives. Intrusion detection system 2 detects as many as 230 attacks, but at least all of the actual 100 attacks have been detected. IDS 3 detects 94 attacks, but only 90 of them are actual attacks. IDS 4 detected 106 attacks, but only 95 are actually attacks. Which of these intrusion systems is the best? Well, this is super complicated because in general, you can't really say what you're optimizing for if you don't know where this is being used. That's just one of the problems. And let me just illustrate that problem concretely. If you're guarding something super important, say, your nuclear weapon system, right? Then detecting all attacks is all of a sudden a lot more important than when you're detecting the web server of a university, right? You really don't want to have any false negatives. You don't want to miss any attacks, even if it means that perhaps you have to manually verify a lot of false positives. Okay, but typically you don't want to have too many false positives. In most cases, your target is not that valuable, and false positives are actually super expensive. Okay, now there are certain cases here. For instance, let's see here, we detected 90 attacks, but only 80 are actual attacks. And here we detected 94 attacks, but only 90 are actual attacks. Okay, so at first blush, you might think that clearly one of these IDS is more usable, more interesting than the other, right? So we only detected 4 more attacks, but we have more actual attacks. Maybe IDS3 is better, but you don't really know that, right? Because they may not have complete overlap in the attacks. Maybe these are somewhat different attacks. These are somewhat different attacks than these ones. So maybe the ones that you have here, the 80 that you have here, are more important attacks than the ones that you have in detected in IDS3. Okay. So it's in general super difficult to determine what is the best intrusion detection system. And to help decide what are good intrusion detection systems, we often use terms such as accuracy, precision, and recall. Measures to evaluate the effectiveness of information retrieval in general. So these are terms that come from information retrieval. Now, what we're trying to retrieve here is also some kind of information, namely whether or not something is an attack or not. And we speak of precision as meaning the number of relevant things divided by the total things in a search. Okay, so in intrusion detection system, the precision is the number of true positives divided by the number of true positives plus the number of false positives. So everything that we flagged, how many of them are real? Okay. Recall is kind of the flip side of that. It's the number of relevant documents divided by the total number of relevant documents. So it's the true positives divided by everything that is true, the total. Okay, so it's the number of true positives divided by the true positives plus the ones that we've missed, the false negatives. Okay, so the true positives divided by the true positives plus the false negatives. It gives a measure of how many you missed, right? So whereas precision gives you a measure of how many of them that you flagged are actually relevant. And then we combine these two in what is known as the AV measure. So AV measure is 2 times the precision times the recall divided by the precision plus the recall. Okay, it gives you some indication of effectiveness that combines both precision and recall. And sometimes we also talk about accuracy of our intrusion detection system, and that basically means what is the percentage of the predictions that were correct? So the true positives and the true negatives divided by the total. So if we now compare these 5 intrusion detection systems, we see that there are major differences. So we have the hits and false alarms here at the top 2 rows, and then we have the recall. This is the recall and the precision on these rows, and this is the F measure. Okay. So if we look at these intrusion detection systems now in the bar charts, and we compare it to the perfect one, which scores 100% on everything, we see that there are major differences. So some of them have really good precision, right? So for instance, this has a really high precision, but it does quite poorly on the recall, right? So conversely, here we have intrusion system 012, which does really well on recall, but really poorly on the precision. And then we have a few that actually score reasonably well on all of them, but with slightly different emphasis. So this one has slightly better precision here than this one, whereas this one has slightly better recall than that one. And the F measure, which combines the lot, you can see that these two are comparable, whereas these ones are considerably lower. This one in particular scores quite badly on the F measure, but also on the precision, even though it has quite good recall. So this was the one that had lots of alerts, so 230, and then it only had, although it had all of the attacks, so 100 of them, 130 of the alerts were actually false positives, right? So it really depends on the context in which this intrusion detection system is used, whether or not this is a good solution or not. But typically, this would not be the greatest solution in the average use case. So how do we compare different IDSs? Well, one common tool to help in deciding which IDS to use is known as the receiver operating characteristic curve. It's a curve that really comes from signal processing, but we use it in intrusion detection systems also. It plots the true positive rate on the y-axis versus the false positive rate on the x-axis. And the true positive rate is the number of true positives amongst all the positives, right? So that's the true positives plus the ones that you've missed, right? So how many true positives did you actually get? Okay, so the proportion of the number of true positives amongst all the positives. And the false positive rate is the number of false positives that you find under all the negatives. So the ones that you actually classified as negatives, but also the ones that you classified as positive, so falsely classified as positives. Okay, so ideally, what you want in an intrusion detection system is to have a curve pretty much like this, right? So you immediately get a very high true positive rate, even with really small false positive rates, right? In reality, the curves will typically be different, right? So the curves will not have this wonderful, immediately shoot up to 100% true positive rate for small versions values of the false positive rate. Okay. What you don't want is to have a curve, and I'm not sure I can draw this correctly, but it's a diagonal here, which is basically just an arbitrary flip a coin idea. So here the true positive rate is equal to the false positive rate. And that means that your intrusion detection system just flips a coin and it gets it right 50% of the time, gets it wrong 50% of the time. That's not very useful. Okay. So what we want is curves that lie, as far as possible on this side. Okay, so this is for the high false positive rates. This would be this curve, right? And for the lower false positive rates, maybe the more practical false positive rates, this would be this curve. In fact, what we typically talk about in these kind of curves is the so-called area under curve. So for this line here, this IDS here, all of this is so-called the area under curve. And it's not going to be very pretty, but this is roughly what we have in terms of the area on the curve for this thing, right? So this also here. And the area on the curve is a good measure of how well this intrusion detection system performs. Because ideally, the area on the curve is 1. So it's going up to 1 immediately, and then stays very high, right? And we don't want anything that is on this line, which is basically half of the area of 1. So anything that is practical should at least be above that for the practical range. And of course, we're typically interested in the area where we don't have crazy false positive rates. Okay, so this allows us to compare different intrusion detection systems, looking at a reasonable range in the false positive rate, and then seeing how that performs in terms of the true positive rate. Now, there's one other thing that we need to get through, and that is the base rate fallacy. It's an old result, even in intrusion detection systems, but it's an important one. And it was originally reported in a paper by Axelson on the base rate fallacy. And it represents a fundamental problem in intrusion detection systems that we need to take into account. And it can be best illustrated by means of an example. instead of an intrusion detection system, we're going to talk about a medical test. And your doctor is going to perform a test on you for a disease, and let's say that the test is 99% accurate, which means that if we perform this on 106 subjects, 99% are flagged as positive, and when we perform it on 100 healthy subjects, 99 are flagged as negative. Now, the doctor performs the test on you, and guess what? You test positive. Now, the doctor also tells you that the rate of incidence in the population is 1 in 10,000. So 1 in 10,000 gets the disease. What is the probability that you're actually sick? And I want you to think about this. Do you just intuitively think this is higher than 90%? Is it 50%? Is it 10%? Is it 4%? 3? I don't know. So intuitively, what do you think is the probability that you are sick? And then we're going to look at whether or not your intuition was right. And we're going to do this with probability calculations, right? So the notation that we're going to use is that if we're sick, we're S, and this is not sick, so that's healthy. This is when we test positively, so this is a bad thing, and this is not testing positive, so a negative test outcome. And what we know is that the probability of testing positively if we're sick is 0.99. And that is the same as the probability of testing negatively when we're not sick. That's also 0.99. We also know that the incident rate is 1 in 10,000. So the probability of being sick in general is 1 in 10,000. Now, what we want to know, that is a question that I asked, is what is the probability that I'm sick given that I tested positively? Okay, so we don't want this one. We don't want the probability of testing positively when we're sick. We want the probability of being sick when we test positively. Now, we know how to calculate this. For calculating such conditional probabilities, we use Bayes' theorem. So Bayes, and you see the chap here, was this statistician, philosopher, and minister who lived in the 18th century, and he came up with this clever way of calculating conditional probabilities, such as P A given B, right? So the probability of A given B. Probability of A given B is the probability of A happening times the probability of B happening given that A happened, divided by the probability of B. Okay, that's great, and we're going to apply this because this is what we want, right? We want the probability of us being sick given that we tested positively. So that is what we're aiming for, PS given T, right? So we're going to use Bayes' theorem for this, and we're also going to make use of the fact that we can calculate the probability of B. In this case, this is the probability. We'll see what B means in our context. But the probability of B can be calculated by the probability of B occurring in all the possible contexts, right? So all the possible, and there's two different events that may happen, A and B. So what we can do is the probability that, for all the possible outcomes of A, right? So A1 to AN, we can say that the probability of B happening is, well, let's look at all the possible outcomes of B occurring in the context of something in an event in A, right? So the probability of B occurring given that AI occurred times the probability of AI occurring. Right? And we do that for every I. So if we do this for A0, A1, A2, A3, and so on, if we have all of those, we have exactly the probability of B occurring. Now, in our formula, we have the probability of being sick, given that we tested positively. If we fill in Bayes' theorem directly, we have the probability of being sick, right? So A is in this case, it's being sick, times the probability of testing positively given that we're sick. Okay? Divided by the probability of testing positively times the probability of testing positive, which is this here. Okay, and we test. The probability of testing positively can be calculated as the probability of testing positively in case we're not sick times the probability that we're not sick, plus the probability of testing positively when we're sick times the probability that we are sick. The incidence rate. Okay. So we can fill that in, and then we arrive at this formula here. And then what we can do is we can substitute for the probability of testing positively, given that we're not sick. What we can substitute for that is 1 minus the probability that we do not test positively, given that we're not sick. Okay, and we know this term here, which was 0.99. Okay. So let's see. We know this one, that's 0.99. We know this one, that's 0.99. We know the probability of here again, 0.99. So we know all of the, we know this one here, 1 in 10,000. Here it is also 1 in 10,000. We now know all the numbers, and we can start filling them in. So the probability of being sick, given that we test positively, is 1 in 10,000 times 0.99, 1 in 10,000 times 0.99, 1 minus 1 in 10,000 times 0.01. And that means that if you do the math, that the probability of you actually having the disease, despite the fact that we were using a very reliable test and we tested positively, is less than 1%. And this is the base rate fallacy. So let's dig into that a little bit deeper. So first, let's do the same exercise, but now without being sick and healthy, but rather an intrusion or no intrusion. So we have I and not I denote intrusion and not intrusion, and A and not A denote an alert. So your IDS generates an alert or no alert. Okay. So the probability of an alert given that there's an intrusion is a true positive rate, and the probability of an alert given that there is no intrusion is the false positive rate. And the goal for our intrusion detection system is to maximize this detection rate, probability of there being an intrusion given that we raise an alert. Okay, and the other thing that we want to maximize is the probability of there not being an intrusion when we do not have an alarm. Okay. And let's assume that we have an event stream of 1 million events, right? And that we have 2 intrusions in our event stream, and each intrusion consists of 10 events. So that means that the probability, the incident rate, the probability of there being an attack is 2 times 10 to the power minus 5. Now, we do the same exercise again. We use Bayes' theorem, we fill in the numbers, and we see that the probability of there being an attack, given that we raised an alarm, is 2 times 10 to the power minus 5. That's relatively small, times the probability of there being an alarm, given that there's an intrusion, which we know, right? And divided by 2 times 10 to the power minus 5, again, small number, times the probability of there being an alarm, given that there is an intrusion, plus 0.99998 times the probability of there being an alarm, given that there's no intrusion. Okay. In other words, what we're seeing is that this detection rate is dominated by the false positive rate. So the false positive rate is the probability of there being an alarm given that there is no intrusion. That is the false positive rate. Okay, and if you have a false positive rate of 10 to the power minus 5 and a true positive rate of 1, the result is 10 to the power minus 5 here, 10 to the power minus 5 here, 10 to the power minus 5 here. So we can cancel all of these cancel out. So we have 2 divided by 2 plus 0.999, so close to 1. In other words, the probability of there being an intrusion, given that we raise an alarm, is only 0.67. Okay, so relatively unreliable results here. So there's the probability of there being false positive is, even in this case, very, very high, right? So with thousands of events or millions of events, you quickly get very many false positives. And that's with a false positive rate of 10 to the power minus 5 and a true positive of 1, okay, which is quite high. So the lesson that we learn here from the base rate fallacy is that the false positive rate starts to dominate the effectiveness of your idea. So false positive rates in practical situations are typically extremely important. You want to keep the false positives down, the number of false positives you want to keep down. Okay, so we talked about the statistics so far. Now let's also briefly visit the outputs that we get from our intrusion detection system, because it matters, right? So the intrusion detection system will produce some output, some alarms, but the question is, what is the alarm? Is it simply something's wrong, or will it actually tell you more? Well, it will definitely tell you the time at which the event occurred, the problem occurred, but it may also tell you sources, the targets, the attack name or type, if the IDS knows it, the impact of the attack, the confidence level, the relationship with the source event stream, so which events were actually involved in this attack. And the more information your IDS produces, the more useful it is for the analyst that looks at this. Okay? And the quality of the intrusion detection output is very important. So the fact that something happened yesterday is, not completely uninteresting, but it's not quite as useful as saying that, your user Robert Tappan Morris attempted to perform a buffer overflow against FingerD, right, at this particular time and on this particular server, etc., from this particular server. Okay, so the quality of the outputs is quite important. So especially for intrusion detection systems that work on anomaly based methods, it's very important that we can train with some data that ideally we know the details of. So we know what kind of events are in there and which parts are attacks. Okay, so a truth file is meta information about an event stream. Okay, and it describes the attacks which are in the system and the relationship between these attacks and the events in the stream. This is not always easy to generate. So sometimes truth files require manual annotation, manual labeling. So this event and this event and this event together, represent this attack. Sometimes we try to generate this automatically. That's a lot more complicated. Okay. But then we can evaluate our detection system and look at the alerts that are produced by an IDS and the truth file that corresponds to that event stream, and then see how well the IDS did compared to the truth file. It will output things like the number of hits, so the true positives, the number of misses, and the number of false positives. Building a good intrusion detection system is not easy at all. So you have to be able to recognize very rare events, malicious actions, in a huge stream of events that generate very few false positives, and do this ideally in real time because you want to detect attacks as they're going on. And even better, ideally, you want to have a response mechanism. And even better than that, you want that to be automated. You want to be able to perform this detection at different levels of abstraction, right? So not just at the lowest level, but also ideally at a somewhat higher level that you can perhaps construct what the attacker is doing. Ideally, correlate this with different monitors and different intrusion detection systems, and perhaps even across security domains. You want to integrate these different security solutions so that you can use these analysis techniques and data sources. You want to deploy these intrusion detection systems in very different environments, take into account the characteristics of the protected machines and networks, and you should make this scalable so that the network speeds and also the number of points is something that you can scale up. All of this is quite complicated, but we don't want to spend too much time on the topic of intrusion detection in general. So these anomaly-based detection and how to train them and all of that. That is a little bit beyond the scope of this course. It's good that you're aware of these properties of these intrusion detection. What I do want to talk about is the kinds of intrusion detection systems that we have. So host-based versus network-based intrusion detection systems, and so on. Host versus network-based intrusion detection systems. Let us start with the host intrusion detection system. The host intrusion detection system monitor what you might call the internals of your system. So it may look for unusual activities. It may look for unusual changes in files or on disk, new accounts being generated, or indeed system call patterns. So many years ago, decades ago, people already came up with the idea of looking at system call patterns that were out of the usual, right? So something that a program never did in terms of a sequence of system calls. All of a sudden, this program starts doing it. Isn't that weird? Maybe this is an attack. Of course, false positives are always a problem there, but it worked reasonably well. Of course, attackers now also know about this, and they specialize and they craft more advanced attacks that do not exhibit unusual system call patterns. So that's an arms race. But these intrusion detection systems and the ones that I'm listing here are mostly based on anomalies. Protect your host itself. Now, one thing that I want to look at is a very special class of intrusion detection systems, which you might argue are not, strictly speaking, intrusion detection systems. So we'll treat them separately. And we'll call them honeypots. And the idea here is that they're special machines. So this is your network configuration. Here's the internet, and there may be attackers out there. Who knows? Here's your attacker. In your networks, you add a number of machines that are really there to be attacked. So these are special machines that look like attractive targets to the attacker, and you wait for these machines to be attacked. And when they're attacked, you analyze what the attacker is doing, maybe obtain some signatures or some patterns that you can then use to detect attacks or detect and stop attacks on legitimate hosts. So that's a honeypot. Okay. Now, in the past, most attacks were indeed on servers from a client application on the internet. But nowadays, many of the attacks are in the opposite direction. So it's an attack on the client application, for instance, a browser. Okay. So a drive-by download will basically happen when you visit a malicious website, and then you download some malicious content, and then you get infected. Now, with this situation, of course, these honeypots will never receive such malicious content, so there's nothing to analyze. So the honeypots have evolved also, and now we have also this concept of a client-side honeypot, which actively goes out and visits websites. For instance, all the websites that you find in spam messages, right? So in the spam folder, you go through all the links, visit all of these websites, click around, do some stuff, and see if there is any attempt to infect your honeypot. Okay, so you analyze this attack while it's going on. So let's have a look at a case study. So what do we mean by analyzing the attack as it's going on? Well, I'm going to take you back a few years. 2006, I believe, we published a paper on the Argos honeypot. And I want to use this as an illustration of what you can do to analyze attacks as they're going on. And I want to also use that as an excuse to very briefly explain what taint analysis is, which you're going to be using in a number of courses in the curriculum. Okay, so taint analysis is a trick to track where, for instance, untrusted data goes. So in the case of Argos, what we had was a virtual machine, an emulator that was running on top of Linux. And it was able to, just run whatever operating system we wanted, such as Windows. And on top of that, we had the applications. And what would happen is that network data would arrive into the system, through Linux, through Argos, and enter Windows. Okay, so this could be attacker data, or it could be benign data. Remember, this system is running as a honeypot, so we're hoping that it gets attacked. Okay. Now, the data that enters the system is tainted in the Argos emulator, which means that it has a shadow memory that is maintained, and that indicates that this data came from the network. So if we load this up a little bit, here's your real memory that is provided to Windows. So this is the memory that Windows sees. And maybe these bytes came from the network here. So this is a byte here and then a byte there. Came from the network and is stored in memory in these locations. What Argos will do is keep a separate shadow memory only in the emulator here, right? Not visible to Windows. And it indicates that this data is tainted. It's coming from an untrusted source. And whenever we copy data, we also copy the taint information. So if we copy data that is coming from the network, so from an untrusted source, we also indicate that whatever location it's copied to will also be tainted. Okay. And then we raise an alarm when such tainted bytes are loaded into the program counter, into the instruction point. Okay, so that's how Argos operates. For instance, if the RAX register is tainted, right? We denote that on this slide by saying the taint of RAX equals 1. Then we go through the instructions, and Argos, the emulator, has changed the instructions that are executed to also propagate taint. Okay? So whenever we see a move of the RAX, the value that's in RAX, into RBX, we also need to propagate that taint. So a move of RAX into RBX means that the taint of RBX will now be the taint of RAX. And if we add RAX and RBX, likewise, we also have to propagate the taint. So we now, since we combine these two, we also combine the taint values. So the taint of the destination register, RBX in this particular case, will be the combination, so the OR of the taint of RAX and the taint of RBX. And sometimes, we have to explicitly clear the taint. So this is taint cleaning. For instance, when we do an XOR of RAX with itself, because exclusive OR of RAX with RAX means that the value 0 will be stored in RAX. So there's nothing left of whatever tainted information was there. So in this case, the taint of the destination register REX becomes 0. And whenever we execute a return instruction, then we check whether or not the return address that we're trying to return to was tainted. And if it's tainted, we raise an alarm. That is how the taint-based honeypot, such as Argos, operates. So taint analysis is used to detect these zero-day attacks because we detect the attack before even a single byte of the attack's payload is executed. So the assumption that we have, and that was valid in those days, is that the attacker will inject some shell code into the system and then divert control flow to the shell code, right? But at any rate, so even for a more modern code reuse attack, it would do the control flow diversion. So a control flow diversion by modifying the return address or a function pointer or what have you. Okay. Now that point is the point where we detect the attack, when the control flow diversion takes place. Okay, so when we try to return to some other instruction is the point where we detect the attack. So that is before anything bad, really bad has happened. We immediately detect the attack. We do not execute even a single instruction in the attacker's code in case of a code injection, which no longer happens much. Okay, but the point is that we detect the control flow. Anyway, so if you find Argos interesting, taint analysis has many purposes. You'll see more of this in the binary malware analysis course, so BAMA. But if you liked Argos, you should also have a look at Minimu, which is a much faster emulator to do taint analysis, and where Argos worked on the level of the entire system. So you have an emulator on which you can run an entire operating system. Minimu does the same thing, but now at the process level. But it's much faster. It's a very interesting, fast implementation of taint analysis. So we've looked at the host IDS. Now let's turn to network intrusion detection systems. A network-based IDS is based on the analysis of network traffic. Okay, and may look at network traffic by putting your network card in promiscuous mode, sucking up a lot of the network traffic, or it may tap into the operating system of a host, so somewhere in the TCP/IP stack, so close to the host IDS. And both methods have advantages and disadvantages. For instance, if we sniff traffic, we get access to events. So we sniff all the traffic in the local area network. We get access to events that correspond to different hosts on the network. Even though we're looking at this one particular point in the network, we actually see traffic from multiple hosts. Moreover, we sit there with our intrusion detection system and don't really bother anyone. We're just sucking up traffic, right? That's all we're doing. Nobody gets slowed down because of our operation. There are also some disadvantages. So the traffic sniffing intrusion detection system is vulnerable to evasion techniques, and we'll talk about evasion in a minute. Okay. It's also limited by switched architectures, right? We've seen that we don't really see all the traffic there unless we do an attack ourselves, so it's an ARP spoofing attack or what have you, which is probably not great, or the switch helps us, right? So by using a span port or so, that it gives us all the traffic. We also may not be able to get very meaningful data if the traffic is encrypted, which is increasingly the case. And there are some performance issues, right? So there may be traffic that is very expensive to process because of fragmentation and reassembly issues. And if this is coming from many hosts from multiple sites, this may be quite a burden on our intrusion detection system. What about tapping into the network stack of the operating system? Well, that has some advantages also. For instance, if the traffic was encrypted, we couldn't really see much when we were doing this by sniffing traffic. But if we tap into the network stack after the traffic has been decrypted and before it's encrypted, we actually see the plain text data. Okay, so we can analyze encrypted data. Moreover, the intrusion detection system and the host system are doing exactly the same thing. So the network stack is exactly the same. And that means that there is no risk that the intrusion detection system processes the packets, reassembles them, for instance, differently from the host, because it is the host. Moreover, the reassembly and defragmentation that you need to do in your intrusion detection system needs to be done anyway. The end host needed to do this anyway. And each individual intrusion detection system that taps into the network stack of a host only processes the data to and from that particular host. So much less traffic needs to be analyzed. There are some disadvantages also, because our intrusion detection system running on the host also uses some of the resources of the host and therefore affects the performance. And we need to deploy this on every host. And each individual intrusion detection system only gets information related to that host rather than this wider view that we saw in the sniffing intrusion detection system. I already mentioned some of the problems that these sniffer-based IDSs may have, and I now want to zoom in on this a little bit more and tell you that the intrusion detection systems may suffer from denial of service attacks. For instance, there are specific implementations of denial of service attack systems for specific intrusion detection systems, sniffer-based intrusion detection systems. So Snort is a really well-known one. You have these system called Snot, Stick, and Mucus that will try to make Snort stop functioning. And this can be done in many different ways. You can use the stateful analysis characteristics to increase the memory or CPU consumption. Just if you send a lot of traffic to that, the IDS might not be able to keep up with it. You can have very long-lasting attacks to contribute to the denial of service. You can have parallel attacks. You can exploit some real-time requirements by using really small fragments that need to be put together, overload the interrupt management, and so on. And you can make use of insertion, evasion, and the denial of service we mentioned already, but insertion and evasion. And that's what I want to talk to you about. Also, nothing new, right? This is old hat, and some of this is fixed. Some of this is still possible, but the principle in general is actually what we're interested in. The principle of insertion and evasion. And the idea of insertion is really quite simple. Here we have our IDS, and here we have our victim, right? And the attacker sits here. So what the attacker wants to send to the end system is some combination of packets that make up an attack, right? So it wants to have this received by the victim. And it makes use of the fact that the way the IDS processes packets is a little different from the way the victim processes packets. So it will send some data. It will send some data to the intrusion detection system, and the intrusion detection system will piece this together and realize that there is some data that sits here, and because of that, it doesn't spell the appropriate message of attack. So it doesn't combine into an actual attack. But it doesn't realize that the victim somehow rejects this packet for some reason. And we'll talk about reasons in a minute. And so the victim actually sees the appropriate attacker's payload. Okay? So it's an insertion attack. Likewise, we can do an evasion attack by using the fact that some things are not accepted by the IDS. So we do exactly the opposite. So now the IDS rejects some part of the network traffic, which is in reality accepted by the end system. So again, the attacker's data stream, it sends some stuff to the victim, which is picked up by the network monitor, by the intrusion detection system, and the intrusion detection system will throw out one of these things because it thinks it's not relevant. We'll talk about reasons in a minute, but this is actually received by the end host, by the victim, and therefore again, the victim sees the entire attacker payload. Now, how would you do this? Well, you can do this by desynchronizing the viewpoints of the intrusion detection system and the victim. And you can do this on different layers. Let's first look at the IP layer. And at the IP layer, you have a number of things that you can play with. For instance, the IP time to live field might be set such that it only reaches the intrusion detection system, but it doesn't reach the host. So if there's a number of hops behind the intrusion detection system, that packet may be dropped before it reaches the destination. Likewise, you may make use of the fact that somewhere downstream there may be a link that accepts only smaller MTUs, right? So, and if you set it to forbid fragmentation, that packet will not reach the victim. You may configure the system, the destination, to drop source rooted packets, which is, not so relevant at this particular point in time anymore. You may time out partially received fragments differently from what happens on the actual victim. You may reassemble overlapping fragments differently depending on the operating system. Testing. So what do I mean by that? Let's have a look at defragmentation behavior. Our IDS, our intrusion detection system, and our victim both receive a number of packets. For instance, these packets A, T, T, A, and also a packet K. But the packet K is not in the right place, right? So there's the offset is such that it sits a little bit beyond the bytes that are still missing. Okay, and then at some point later, it receives an additional packet which contains C and H, where H, this part, overlaps with the part that we've already received. Now, what should you do in this particular case? As an operating system, as the network stack in Windows and Linux and BSD and the other operating systems that are out there. There are two options, right? What we can do is only fill in this hole with C and leave the K in place. Or what we can do is remove the K and simply copy in the new data in this place. And depending on your operating system, you may make different choices, which means that you actually see different messages. What you could also have, and that is less of an issue, is a packet that you've already received, and then you receive a packet that overlaps partially with something that you've already received where the hole is on the other side. Now, this should typically not create problems. It should always resolve to attack and never to attack. So this should not override that. So such IP reassembly differences do exist. So depending on whether reassembling favors the packets that arrive first or last, or packets with the lowest offsets, fragments may end up in very different positions. Okay, and we call these combinations first, last, Linux, BSD, and BSD right. And if you want to know more about that, here's the link. I'm just going to very briefly look at the example that corresponds to that. In this case, we have an attacker that sends IP fragments as follows. So time is on the x-axis. So we send the first fragment here at t equals 0. right? And the first fragment contains 3 times 8 bytes, and it starts at offset 0. Okay. Then a little while later, it sends fragment 4, which contains 4 times 8 bytes, 4 times 8 bytes, and it starts at offset basically 8 bytes into the packet, right? So at offset 1, but that's 8 bytes. Offset block, cell number 1, which is 8 bytes. Every cell is 8 bytes. Okay, it sends fragment 2 here a little while later, but it overlaps with fragment 4 partially. It overlaps here. It sends fragment 3 together with fragment 5 with complete overlap, and then it sends fragment 6 after that. So fragment 6 contains, again, 3 times 8 bytes, right? So, oops, 3 times 8 bytes. And the offset is, where's my cursor? Here's my cursor. And the offset is, well, 72 divided by 8 is 9. So it's the 9th 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9th cell here. Okay, so that's what the attacker sends. How would this be received? Well, it very much depends on your network stack. And the possibilities are quite numerous. So it may be reassembled as, first we take all of these packets here, so the fragments here, the 1 fragment, we ignore that this has been sent and overlaps with these fragments here. We'll just continue with 4 after that. Then we have the 2 fragments here. Then we have all 3 of these fragments here, where we completely ignore the fragments 5 and the fragments for 5, and then we receive the fragment 6 after that. So all of them have 6, of course, because it doesn't overlap with anything at the end. Okay? But it could also be reassembled as just take the first one of the first fragment, then we take the first one of the 4th fragment, so that's what we've done here, and then all of the 4 fragments, and then we take the second one of the 2nd fragment, and so on. So this is what has been done by the Cisco implementation at that time. Okay. Linux takes a slightly different choice, so it takes the first 3, then it takes 2 of the purple ones, 2 of the 4s, then it takes 1 of the 2, then it takes the 5s instead of the 3s, and it takes a 6. So the combinations that are possible are quite numerous, and if your intrusion detection system takes one implementation and your victim contains a different one, you might actually end up with a different view of what is being sent by the attacker. Just like at the IP level, we might also desynchronize things at the TCP level. For instance, when your host when one of the hosts does not accept packets that contain certain options because it simply won't allow these options, or when it has protection against wrapped sequence numbers. This is called pause protection against wrapped sequence numbers, which will silently drop packets that have old timestamps. Now, if one of your hosts does this and the other one doesn't, you get a desynchronized view. Maybe also your destination doesn't check the sequence numbers on the reset messages, or your destination may resolve conflicting TCP segments differently depending on the operating system. All sorts of possibilities. Just like in IP, there are all sorts of possibilities in TCP also. For instance, when it comes to reassembly behavior, we could have backward overlap and forward overlap, right? So with backward overlap, you favor old data, and with forward overlap, you favor new data. Okay? And that's the common case, but the Windows NT 4.0 implementation favored old data. Maybe there are other implementations also that I don't know. But anyway, there's another possibility to desynchronize the view of the data that's been received in the IDS from the host. Testing, testing. So how do we solve these issues? Well, one thing that you could do is in your IDS, take into account the topology of the network. So you know how many hops behind you is a particular host, and you have to accommodate for that when you look at the TTL, the time to live field, and so on. And you also have to take into account the operating system of the target, the potential targets, the victims. Okay, and you have to take into account the installed services and the configuration. Now, all of that is very difficult to scale because keeping that valid over a longer period of time, and new equipment is being added and old equipment is being removed, is very complicated. So what happens in practice quite frequently is that instead the traffic is scrubbed. A normalizer module will make all the traffic look uniform and acceptable in the exact same way, right? So it will block malformed traffic that it doesn't know how to handle, that may have certain options. So nobody will receive this. It will reassemble the network traffic in one particular way, so that intrusion detection system and the potential victims all have a synchronized view on what they have received. So let's go back to evaluating intrusion detection systems, and in this particular case, a network intrusion. How would you evaluate this? Well, you may look at the effectiveness of the intrusion detection system, how many of the attacks are detected, how many of those alarms that you've generated were false positives, so the precision, what is the performance, how much of your traffic can you actually process. Certainly if you have really high speed links, such as in the internet exchanges here in Amsterdam, you cannot do very expensive processing. You may not be able to process every single packet. Okay? um, and the descriptiveness. So what kind of reports are you getting out of your intrusion detection? Intrusion detection systems probably deserve a course on their own, and there are many problems with building these things in practice. There's the problem of false positives. We've already mentioned this. It's one of the most complicated problems. We have a large number of alerts, or we may have positives that are not false positives, but are not so interesting. Maybe you get a lot of positives on a port scan, which, admittedly may be an indication that an attack might occur, but it's less interesting than the actual attack occurring. So if your most relevant alerts get drowned by all of these other alerts, that is problematic also. And then there's also the problem of many alerts not having enough information, not being descriptive enough. In the remainder of this set of slides, I've included something that is intended for self-study. It's about alert correlation, which tries to make use of the fact that maybe there are multiple intrusion detection systems that all generate some alerts, maybe somewhat different alerts. But having those different alerts allow you to piece together more about what attack is going on. It helps you to reduce the number of alerts and certainly the number of relevant positives. Okay. So the idea is to get a big picture from the various pieces detected by each of the IDSs. And the thing that we're going to make use of in that set of slides that I won't go through in great detail, this is really self-study, is the combination of alerts from different systems that have similar attributes. Okay, so that you can have one single resulting alert that contains information from all of these sub alerts, but perhaps has more interesting information as a result of that. Okay, and fewer of these total number of alerts. And the So the final slides in this set of lecture slides on network protection is not exam material. It's meant for self-study. So you learn more about how this use of intrusion detection system actually occurs in practice. And it's all about alert correlation. So what you're trying to do is fix the problems of intrusion detection systems by making use of the alerts, the information that is produced by different intrusion detection systems, multiple intrusion detection systems that are deployed. Some of them might be in the host, some of them might be in the network, and so on. And because of that, you can reduce the number of alerts, you can reduce the number of false positives and the number of non-relevant positives. You can find higher level attack patterns rather than, something is happening, some event is happening here which is out of the ordinary. You can maybe say something, I think there is this kind of attack going on our system here, and the real target is that host, right? Some higher level piece of information. And you can prioritize alerts so that you don't focus on all the port scans that may not be super relevant, but rather focus on the actual attacks that matter. Okay? So you will form some big picture from the different pieces that are provided by the individual IDSs. And the first thing that you do is to aggregate. So you're combining alerts that are somewhat similar, they have the same attributes. And because of this, you reduce the number of alerts that you generate. Then you try to correlate things and infer some higher level attack patterns. So you go from a port scan, then you see something happening on a particular host by maybe another intrusion detection system, and then you see something happening on that host that looks suspicious also to attack another machine. What you can infer is not just something is trying to scan or something is generating and sending an exploit to that machine, but rather this is what the attacker was doing. The attacker was doing a reconnaissance of the network, found the machine that ran a vulnerable version of, I don't know, Apache or Nginx, got onto that machine, elevated its privileges, and then tried to attack some other machine, right? So that's a much higher level picture of what is going on and a much more interesting one. And the way you can do that is by means of a requires provides analysis. So you have some knowledge of different kinds of attacks, and for each of them you have listed some required capabilities. Like you can pull this attack off if you can do this. Okay, so the required capabilities that the attacker must possess. And then once you pulled off this attack, you obtain these new capabilities. For instance, you go from a local user, so you've obtained access to a process, local user, you go to a root user. You elevate privileges, right? But to be able to do that, you need to have some way of generating inputs or so, some requirements that you need to fulfill. And then you can actually obtain root privileges. Okay, and that provides maybe some missing piece, some requirement for the next step in the attack. Okay? So in other words, you dynamically join the different attacks in using this requires provides analysis. So here's an example. Let's say we know a vulnerability in Apache that will give local access to the attacker. Okay, so the requirements are very minimal. You just need to be able to send some network packets, some HTTP requests to the Apache server, and as a result, you get local access on that machine. Okay, so the next step is to take that local access and obtain root access. So to gain root access, maybe you can make use of the Linux BRK attack. Okay, so the Linux BRK attack goes from local access to root access. So the requirement is that you have to have local access first. Now you have root access. What can you do after that? Well, with the root permissions, you can send raw traffic on the network, and you can take it to the next step, right? Or you can, I don't know, do stuff and create user accounts on the machine. All sorts of things that you will be able to do, and that requires root access first. Okay, so with the requires provides analysis, you can stitch together the various steps in the overall attack. And therefore, once you see these different steps, you can also puzzle together that this is the higher level pattern. And then still, you want to do some filtering, right? You want to separate the important alerts from the less important alerts. And you can do that on the basis of how important a particular class is. What will it offer you? Will it offer you just some knowledge of I don't know which services open at a particular port, or will it actually give you I don't know root access? How important is the asset that is being attacked? Is this your nuclear control computer, or is it just some server that's running some IoT device that is not security critical at all? And so all of these things you can use in filtering out the more important attacks from the less important. And in the remainder of the slides, I actually have an example where we have a vulnerable Apache server at this particular IP address, and we have a host and application-based intrusion detection systems on this network. There are a number of other machines on the internal network, and it's connected to the internet. There's an other web server running at all of these hosts. So 10.0.0 and then 10 to 13 all run a different web server. And then we have two network-based intrusion detection systems monitoring the network. The attacker is at this IP address, and then we also, at the same time, in this stream that we are analyzing, this set of events, there happens to be a scanning attack. So somebody's port scanning our services. Now, we don't care about the scan. We care about the attacker trying to get access to our web server and therefore our machines. So we assume that the attacker scans the victim host while the worm tries to exploit an IIS vulnerability across multiple hosts. The attacker will then exploit the Apache, and then the attacker escalates to root using these steps that we saw earlier in the requires provides analysis. Okay? Now we need to separate what is relevant from not what is not relevant, and what is a high priority attack and what is not so high priority. And this is not trivial, right? So we have here a timeline with all sorts of events that occur because of the attacks and the port scans that are going on, and it's complicated, right? So what really happened? First of all, we get alerts for the same event, right? So we have a scanning event from this particular IP address from the attacker to the Apache server, picked up by one intrusion detection system and another intrusion detection system, but they look differently. They look different, right? So the first IDS calls it scanning, the other IDS calls it port scan. And then we have other events that are going on, also picked up by the two sensors. And if you're unlucky, all of these are going to be non-uniform. And then you have some question about what is really going on and what are the most relevant events. Now, how do we start dealing with this long stream of events related to potentially attacks, or maybe just some port scans that are not so super interesting? Now, to go through this from these multiple viewpoints, these multiple IDSs, we have to go through a number of steps to normalize the alerts, to process them to some extent, to fuse them, to verify them, etc., etc., and finally we need to prioritize them. So normalization is a simple step where we try to transform all of the alerts from the different sensors into some standardized format so that they all are called scanning or port scan or whatever it is. You don't have all these different formats of the different sensors. Okay? So if we apply that to the timeline of events that we saw earlier, now everything here is called port scan. So we didn't have many variations in this particular example, but now everything is at least called the same. But there are still some issues here, right? So for instance, we have an alert here, which I deliberately skipped earlier, but it's weird because it misses information that would, surely would be interesting. So sensor A provides no information about the host, about the IP address. Yeah, it says local hosts and it says the source is whatever. Okay, now the next step then is we do some pre-processing to add missing attributes such as timestamps and the IP addresses of the host-based alerts and the attack type and so on, utilizing some rules to generate these missing alerts, missing attributes. For instance, here we see that now the IP addresses have been properly filled in. Localhost has become 10.0.0.1 and the source is 10.0.0.1. Okay, great. And here also we have some more information added to our set of events. So this looks much better, but we still have this redundancy of information. For instance, here we have two alerts for what is essentially the same port scan, coming from the same source to the same target, right? Picked up by two different sensors, but who cares? Same thing occurs, I think, here, right? So the IS exploit is also the same, picked up by two different sensors. So the next step in our processing of these alerts and the correlation of these alerts is to do some alert fusion, combining alerts that represent the same attack occurrence. Some sliding time window going over the alerts and seeing whether or not they can be grouped together. And here we see the result of this. We now have removed some of these alerts and combined them into a single alert, okay, to make it more manageable. Oops. Now what we're going to do is to see if we can verify the alerts. There may be, a pattern of an attack that we detected in the network, but maybe it's not relevant for our service. Maybe the pattern is for a version of IIS or web server or some other server that we don't even run, right? So what we can do is see whether or not this might be relevant for us. Okay. So using information about which services are installed or doing an on-demand vulnerability scan or some other things, we can maybe rule out one particular alert which we already aggregate, which we already fused together. Okay, so it turns out that this was not a relevant one. We can remove it from our list. Okay, great. So this is again looking better already. Next, we want to see whether we can combine the attacks from one attacker against a particular target, again to reduce the alerts. Okay. For instance, we may see that there's a lot of attempts to do something like password guessing or brute forcing of numbers or denial of service attacks. If we see many of these against a particular target, we actually group them together and say, oh, this is what is going on. Okay, so you merge these alerts with the matching source and destination address, and you get something such as this one, right? So where two of them are part of a thread, right? And then we have even more reduction. And by the way, this one was gone, right? So just to see, this is crossed out. And this simplifies it even further. And then we're going to try to reconstruct the session. So to link the network-based and the host-based alerts coming from different intrusion detection systems. And that is something that we typically need more information for than provided by the alerts that we analyzed. So what we can do is use this database or on-demand probing, some active measures that we use to find additional information. So here we find that there's a session going on. This is it belongs to each other. Okay. Next step is to identify what the attacker really tries to target, right? So we identify the hosts that are either the source or the target of a large number of alerts. Okay, and this allows you easily to identify worms, DDoS attacks, and so on. So we see here that there's a one-to-many attack. So this is just trying to, attack many hosts and many ports on the different hosts. Whereas this one is more, interesting, perhaps. Finally, we do multi-step. Finally, I forget, but maybe it was one of the final steps. We do a multi-step correlation where we infer these higher level attack patterns. Is this just a port scan with a break-in, or is it just a port scan, or is it a port scan followed by a break-in, followed by some escalation, followed by island hopping? That would all be interesting as part of the attack pattern. Okay, and that we can do with this requires provides model that we saw earlier. So, for instance, we may detect that this is a scan here, followed by a break-in, followed by an escalate, a local exploit that escalates to root. Okay, and here we find much less interesting information. We can determine the impact of the attack on the protected network using some knowledge of what the assets are, and link the failures to attacks that we may have. For instance, we may see that because of this attack, DNS is down, or mail is down, or what have you. Okay. So that is an important impact that we find that. And on the basis of that, we may start prioritizing. So to help the system administrator to focus on the problems that are most important, it will be able to prioritize. And this, of course, depends on the security policy of the site. But for instance, you can ignore perhaps the less immediate threats, the port scans. So we got something like this. This might be considered critical, and this might be just a medium. Now, correlation is actually quite complicated. It's difficult because you have a shortage of criteria, shortage of realistic test data, shortage of truth files. Comparisons are always complicated. It's really hard to correlate alerts with respect to infrastructure emission. So anyway, so all of these correlation requirements are quite complicated. But we do see that because of the steps that we follow, normalization, and then looking at what is going on, putting things together, fusing things, and determining sessions, and what have you, we have reduced the large number of low-level alerts and created something that is more interesting, high-level, and more actionable for the administrator. So this is what we want to say about correlating events from different IDSs. This was, a little bit high over, but it's just to give you a flavor of this. Just like the network protection side is giving you a flavor of intrusion detection systems. And with that, we've reached the end of this topic. So we just wanted to touch upon network protection and general protection, I guess, intrusion detection and intrusion prevention. Without diving too deeply into this, there is a lot more to be said about the different kinds of protection systems, but that would be for another course.